Montana Territory. Autumn of 1873, the wind was sharp with coming snow when Flint Sutter saw her. He was riding east, dust in his beard and 5 days of trail behind him, when his horse slowed without him asking. That was when he noticed the shape by the side of the wagon trail. A woman, hunched low, wrapped in a threadbare shawl that barely reached her elbows. Her dress was torn, skirt mudded up to the knees, boots so worn the toes had split open. She was standing still like she had been waiting for something, or maybe she had given up waiting. Flint tipped his hat back and rode past her silent. He got 20 steps ahead before his gut twisted. He stopped, turned his horse around. She looked up when he came back. Her face was pale, lips chapped, eyes rimmed red. But there was steel in how she stood, even in rags. "You want a ring or a ride?" Flint asked, voice low but steady. She blinked, not understanding. "I mean," he said, dismounting slow, "you need a husband or you just need to get the hell out of here." Her mouth parted like she might cry, but no tears came. She straightened her shoulders. "A ride," she said. "Please." He nodded once. "Name, Georgia," she said. "Georgia Stills." He ducked his head. "Flint Sutter." He held out a gloved hand, not pressing her to shake it, but she did. Her fingers were cold and thin. He helped her mount behind him, careful, gentle. Once she was settled, arms loosely around his waist, he clicked to the horse. They moved out under the wide sky, the wind pressing against them. They rode for hours without speaking. The sun was dropping behind the hills when he finally asked, "How long you been out here?" "3 days," she whispered. "Maybe 4." He turned his head. "Alone?" She nodded against his back. "My uncle left, took the wagon, said I was bad luck. I would slow him down." Flint's jaw worked, but he said nothing for a while. He rode a little harder, like he could outpace the fury building in his chest. They made camp by a creek. Georgia tried to help, but her hands were shaking too hard. Flint laid out his bedroll and gave her the blanket off his saddlebag. He did not ask questions. He lit a fire, cooked beans, and handed her the tin plate. She ate like she had not tasted food in days. When she was done, she looked at him across the fire. "You meant it back there." "Meant what?" "About the ring." He stared into the flames. "Not something a man should joke about." Georgia lowered her eyes. "I do not need saving." He leaned forward, forearms on his knees. "I did not say you did." Silence settled between them, but it was not empty. It was the kind that held breath and weight and something neither of them had words for yet. She slept first, curled under his blanket, eyes finally closed without fear. Flint sat a while longer, staring at the fire, listening to the wind and the rush of water nearby. Then he lay down beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could reach for him if the night brought bad dreams. Morning came cold and quiet. Georgia was already awake when he opened his eyes, standing at the creek, washing her face with trembling hands. "You got somewhere to go?" he asked once they packed up. "No," she said. "Not anymore." He studied her, the way she squared her shoulders like she had to fight her way through every hour of the day. She had something in her that had not broken, and he respected that. "There is a town west of here," he said. "Dry Creek. I was heading there. Work for me at the stables. There is a widow runs a boarding house. You could stay there for a while." She looked up at him. "Why are you helping me?" Flint shrugged. "You looked like you needed someone." She nodded once, slow. "All right." They rode together again, this time more familiar. She leaned with him in the saddle, her grip stronger. By the time they reached Dry Creek, the sun was high and the wind had softened. Flint introduced her to Mrs. Hartley, who ran the boarding house. Georgia got a clean room and a bath. Flint paid for her first week without asking her permission. She tried to argue, but he raised a hand and said, "Let me do this." He went to the stables that afternoon, mucked stalls, checked the colts, talked with the old rancher who ran the place. He did not see Georgia until the next morning. She came to the pens wearing a borrowed dress, clean now, hands raw from scrubbing floors for Mrs. Hartley. She looked stronger already. "I want to work," she said. "I will do anything. I do not want to sit around and owe anyone." Flint nodded once. "All right, come on." She learned fast. Cleaned the tack, fed the horses, helped with the morning watering. Flint watched her not with pity but a quiet admiration. She did not complain. She did not break. One evening, 2 weeks in, they sat on the back porch of the stable, watching the sun sink over the prairie. Georgia brushed dust from her skirt and looked toward the horizon. "I used to think I would marry some banker's son," she said. "Live in a house with lace curtains. That feels like someone else's dream now." Flint looked at her. "You want lace curtains?" She smiled, soft and small. "I want to feel safe. I want to stop running." His voice was quiet. "You are not running anymore." She turned to him then, really looked. "Why did you come back for me?" Flint's eyes held hers. "Because I could not ride past and forget you were out there." She nodded, swallowed, looked down at her hands. "What if I said I want both?" He tilted his head. "Both, the ring and the ride." Flint reached out, took her hand slow. "Then I will give you both. But only if you mean it." "I do," she said. "I mean it." He smiled at her then, wide and real. She smiled back, and in that moment Georgia Stills knew she was never going to be alone again. The first snow came early that year, soft and heavy, laying quiet over Dry Creek in a hush that made even wagon wheels slow down. Georgia stood at the side of the stable, brushing down the old mare with steady strokes. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows, and her fingers were red from the cold, but her movements were sure. Flint came from the far paddock, arms full of split wood. He stacked it by the stable door, then leaned against the frame, watching her work. "You ever seen snow fall straight like that?" Georgia didn't look up. "Once, in Kansas. I was 12. My mother made cornbread and we all stayed in, played cards by lamplight." Flint shifted his weight, boots crunching frost. "Sounds good." It was. She finally turned to him. "She died the next winter. Fever," he nodded once. "You got anyone left?" "Not anymore." Her voice didn't tremble. "You," he tugged at a leather strap on his glove. "A brother. Somewhere near Fort Keogh. We haven't talked in 5 years. He leave, or you did." I stayed. He couldn't. Flint tilted his chin toward the hills. He had a bad way of taking blame for things no one asked him to carry. Georgia set the brush down and crossed her arms. "Sounds familiar." They stood quiet for a beat, snow drifting between them. "I found something," he said, reaching into his coat. "Figured it might suit you better than the shawl." He handed her a wool jacket, worn but intact, buttons still strong. She ran her fingers over the stitching. "This yours?" "Used to be." "Too tight through the shoulders now." She slid it on, sleeves long past her wrists. "It's warm." "Good." She looked up. "You giving me everything you outgrow?" He met her eyes. "Just what you need." She nodded once, then turned back to the mare. "You always this quiet?" "Only when there's something I don't want to scare off." That made her pause, but she didn't answer. Not right away. Later that evening, Georgia brought 2 bowls of rabbit stew from the boarding house kitchen, where Mrs. Hartley had let her help with supper. They ate by the stove in the tack room, legs stretched out, steam rising from the bowls. Flint broke a piece of biscuit and handed half to her. "You ever think about leaving here?" she asked. He chewed slow. "Sometimes, but I figure most places are just different kinds of hard." She nodded. "I thought I'd end up in St. Louis. I had a cousin there, wrote me once, said I could learn to sew and take in mending." "What stopped you?" "Didn't have the train fare. Then the cousin married a riverboat man and stopped writing." He leaned back against the wall. "You still want to go?" Georgia sipped from her bowl. "No, I want a place where the ground doesn't shift under me." Flint watched the firelight flicker across her face. You think maybe this could be that place? She looked at him, long and steady. If it is, she said, it's because of you. He set his bowl down. I ain't good with pretty words. I'm not asking for them. Flint reached over, slow and careful, and took her hand. She let him. They sat like that, quiet and close, the warmth between them steadier than the stove. Neither of them said what it meant. They didn't need to. Not yet. It was there in the way their hands stayed clasped as the fire burned low, in the way her head leaned toward his shoulder but didn't quite touch. Outside, snow kept falling. Inside, something else had begun to settle. Not soft, but certain. Like roots finding hold, by mid-December the ground wore a thick crust of snow that cracked underfoot, and the days shortened until dusk came before supper. Georgia had taken to wearing Flint's old trail coat in the mornings, the hem brushing her calves as she crossed the stable yard. She'd begun wearing her hair back in a braid, tucked beneath a scarf to keep the wind from biting at her scalp. The stable roof needed patching, and Flint spent 3 days up there, hammering through the brittle cold. Georgia held the ladder steady when he climbed, passed him nails and boards, her gloves patched at the palms. They didn't speak much, but when they did, it was in the quiet tones of people used to relying on one another. One night, after the patch held through a storm that dropped a hard inch of ice, Flint came into the boarding house kitchen to return a borrowed axe. Georgia stood at the hearth, sleeves pushed high, stirring a pot of parsnips and onions. "You should eat with me tonight," she said without turning. He set the axe down against the doorframe. "You sure? There's enough." "And I made coffee." He hung his hat on the peg beside the stove and pulled up a chair. She ladled stew into 2 bowls and set them on the table. For a while, the only sounds were spoon against enamelware and the wind scratching along the eaves. "You ever think about planting something?" she asked, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "Nothing grows in that stable." "I meant land of your own, somewhere you could put down seed." Flint leaned back in his chair, fingers curled around the coffee tin. "I've thought about it." Never had much reason to stop long enough. Georgia ran her thumb along the rim of her bowl. "What if you did now?" He looked at her, and she didn't look away. "I've got a little money," she said. "Mrs. Hartley's been fair. I've saved some. You don't owe me anything." "That's not what I'm saying." He set the cup down slow. "Then tell me what you are saying." She folded her hands in her lap. "I want to be where you are, Flint. Not just in town, not just working the same yard. I want to wake up where there's no guessing, no waiting to be left behind." He stood, crossed the kitchen, and crouched in front of her chair, his hands resting lightly on her knees. "You're not guessing," he said. "Not anymore." Her breath caught, but she didn't cry. "You mean that?" "I wouldn't say it if I didn't." The next morning they rode out past the edge of Dry Creek, up where the trees thinned and the hills rolled gentle. Flint showed her a plot he'd once helped fence, back when the land agent was trying to sell it off cheap to whoever had strong hands and the patience to build from nothing. "Still unclaimed," he said. "So far as I know." Georgia dismounted and walked the ridge, her boots crunching frost, eyes scanning the slope down to the creek curve below. "There's room here," she said, "for a garden, a barn." "And a house," he added. She turned to him. "Let's make it ours." They rode back into town that afternoon and stopped at the land office. The clerk was half asleep behind the counter, but he roused quick enough when Flint dropped a small tin box on the desk. "Cash?" the clerk asked, surprised. "We don't want credit," Georgia said beside him. Paperwork took an hour. When they left, Flint held the signed deed in his coat pocket, and Georgia reached for his gloved hand. They didn't speak as they walked back to the boarding house, but when they passed the church, Georgia paused. "You think Reverend Miles would marry us come Sunday?" Flint looked at her, the way her eyes held his now without hesitation. If he won't, we'll find someone who will." She smiled. Not soft, not shy. Certain, back at the stable, Flint pulled the small cedar box from under his bedroll. He'd carved it years ago, kept it empty until he had something worth keeping inside. Now, he opened it and slid out the silver ring he'd bought from a peddler in Helena 2 winters back. He hadn't known then who it was for. He knew now. He found Georgia out behind the hay barn, watching the sun slide behind the hills. He stepped beside her. Didn't speak right away. She glanced at him. "You look like you've got something to say." He held out the ring. She didn't cry. She held out her hand and he slid it on. They stood like that till the last light faded, side by side. The winter wind at their backs and a future stretched out ahead of them, wide as the land they'd chosen together. 3 days after Reverend Miles married them in the drafty chapel at the edge of town, Georgia stepped off the wagon beside their new land with a crate of dried beans in her arms and a plan forming behind her eyes. The hard-packed soil crunched beneath her boots, and the wind brought with it the distant sound of a hawk crying over the ridge. Flint unloaded the lumber, his coat dusted with sawdust from the mill. He glanced at her without speaking. She set the crate down beside a canvas sack of salt pork and turned toward the slope where they'd marked the house foundation with stones. "You want the stove near the back or front wall?" she asked. He answered after a moment. "Back. That way it'll hold heat better through the sleeping hours." She nodded. "Then the bed'll go by the east window." He looked up from the timber. "You planning to sleep past sunrise now?" "Maybe once or twice," she said. "If the wind lets me." They worked until their breath showed white and the first boards were laid. Flint set a beam and drove the nails while Georgia steadied it from the opposite side, her gloves stiff with cold. They didn't talk much, but the rhythm of the work fell into something steady between them. At dusk, they lit the small fire ring they'd circled with stones. She boiled coffee in the tin pot while he sharpened his hatchet by firelight. The silence was companionable, filled with the scrape of steel and the soft crackle of flame. Georgia glanced toward the dark outline of the trees. "When I was a girl, I used to imagine a place that didn't feel borrowed." Flint didn't look up. "And this doesn't feel like yours." She pulled the pot from the coals and poured 2 cups, her hands steady. "Not yet, but it will." He took the offered tin and sipped. "You always that patient?" "No," she said. "But I'm learning." The next morning, she rode into town alone for seeds and a second-hand kettle. The general store clerk gave her a long look, but she returned it with one that said she wasn't there to be questioned. When she left, she had what she came for and nothing more. By the time she returned, Flint had the frame of the door standing. He didn't ask about town, and she didn't offer. That night, she brought out a folded scrap of paper from her satchel. She spread it on the upturned crate they used as a table. "I drew what I want the garden to look like," she said. "There's room for potatoes here and beans on the fence line." He studied it with a furrowed brow. "You measure all that by pace," she said. "I checked twice." He traced a line with his finger. "What's this corner? Herbs. If I can get mint and horehound to take." He looked at her across the fire glow. "You planning to mend more than horses and hay burns?" "If someone needs it," she said. "There's too many folks out here living half sick and calling it normal." He leaned back. "You always carry this many plans in your head." "Only since I had a place to set them down." By the following week, the roof was on, and the window frames stood bare against the wind. Flint slept inside on a straw pallet, and Georgia curled beside him beneath a blanket stitched from 2 patched quilts they'd bartered off a ranch widow. They didn't speak much before sleep, but she always reached for his hand, and he never let go. One morning, after sunrise had already climbed the ridge, Georgia stirred the ashes in the hearth and said, I want to ask something. Flint sat up, rubbing his jaw. Ask it. If I were to bring in a girl from Dry Creek, one of the ones with nowhere else to go, would you mind? He didn't answer right away. You mean to take her in permanent? Not unless she wants that, but just for a while, until she finds her own ground. He ran a hand through his hair. You think she'd help with the garden? She'd help with whatever needed doing. But that's not why I'd ask her. He nodded slowly. Then bring her. Georgia looked down at the coals. I don't want this being just for us. I want it to mean something more. He leaned forward, his voice low. It already does, but I'll follow wherever you lead. She smiled faintly, not with triumph, but with something steadier. Then we'll build it that way. The house took form with slow, careful days, each board hammered with purpose, each decision made together. And by the time the first crocus pushed up through the thawing earth, there was a door that closed against the wind, a stove that burned through the night, and a garden bed waiting for seed. Georgia stood on the porch one morning, the hem of her dress brushing the wooden boards, and watched the pale sky stretch wide over their land. Flint joined her, coffee in hand. You still want both? He asked, voice quiet beside her. She looked past the fence line, where the first shoot of green had broken ground. I already have it. And beside her, Flint watched the sun rise, the light spilling over the land they'd built with bare hands and steady hearts, no longer just surviving, but choosing every morning to stay. By late March, the wind had softened and the cottonwoods near the creek showed tight buds the color of pale brass. Georgia walked the fence line with a small bundle of wire in her skirt pocket, checking each post for looseness. Flint was in the south field, digging shallow trenches for the rain runoff, his back bent steady to the work. When she reached the far end, she saw a shape coming up the ridge path, a girl on foot, a small sack slung over one shoulder. Georgia didn't move until the girl reached the gate. She had straw-colored hair, a narrow face, and shoes so worn the right one had split at the heel. I'm looking for Georgia Sutter, the girl said, voice thin but clear. You found her. The girl nodded, shoulders tight. Mrs. Hartley said you might take someone in. She said you don't ask too many questions. Georgia studied the girl's eyes. What's your name, Mabieth? Georgia opened the gate and stepped back. There's bread left from this morning. Come in and eat. Mabieth hesitated, then stepped through like she wasn't sure it would hold. Inside the house, Georgia poured water from the kettle and laid out a plate with 2 thick slices. Mabieth sat straight, hands in her lap, knees pressed together like she was waiting to be told the terms. I don't promise anything long, Georgia said, but there's work if you're willing. No one here's going to touch you or tell you what you owe. Mabieth looked up and her eyes softened just a little. I can milk and sew some. Georgia nodded. We'll find room. Flint came in at dusk, boots muddy and brow damp. He paused when he saw Mabieth on the bench, then turned to Georgia. She'll stay a while, Georgia said. He didn't ask why. We've got enough blankets. I'll piece together another roll tonight. Mabieth slept on a cot near the hearth. Georgia gave her an old kerchief for her hair and a bar of lye soap. She didn't ask what Mabieth had run from. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she'd come here, and she'd been met at the gate with welcome. In the following days, Mabieth proved quick and quiet. She rose early, helped turn the soil in the garden, and took to feeding the chickens Georgia had bartered from a neighbor in exchange for 3 jars of dried horehound. She didn't flinch at the sound of hammering or loud voices, just moved through the days with a kind of cautious relief. One afternoon, clouds gathered low and the air held a damp hush. Georgia stood in the lean-to they'd built beside the house, sorting through seed sacks. Flint came in, brushing rain from his sleeves. The creek's risen, he said. I moved the tools to higher ground. She nodded. We'll need to brace the root cellar door. He stepped closer, his hand resting against the beam beside her. "I've been thinking on building another room." Georgia looked up. "For maybeeth, for whatever comes. Extra hands. A child maybe someday." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for the seed packet marked marrow bean and held it in her palm. "I never thought I'd have anything that grew because I put it there," she said. "You do now." She looked at him then, eyes steady. "I want that child." When the time's right. Flint's hand slid to her waist, rough palm against the back of her dress. "So do I." That night the rain came down fierce. Georgia lay awake, listening to it drum against the roof. Flint's arm was across her ribs, his breath warm against her neck. Maybeeth stirred once in the other room but didn't cry out. The house held firm. By midsummer, the garden had taken root. Beans climbed the fence posts, and the mint patch spread quicker than expected. Georgia kept a ledger in the kitchen drawer, marking harvest dates and the names of women in town who'd asked for tinctures. Maybeeth stitched new curtains for the front window out of flour sacks, hemming them with a piece of blue thread she'd carried from her mother's sewing box. One morning, Georgia found Flint standing at the edge of the field, arms crossed, watching the sun rise over the ridge. She came up beside him. "We've done well," she said. He nodded. "You made this happen." "We did." He glanced down. "You still want lace curtains?" She smiled. "No." "These'll do." Flint turned to her fully, took both her hands in his. "I never figured on this. A home. A wife who doesn't scare easy. A girl in the next room who looks at you like you hung the moon." Georgia squeezed his fingers. "You give us steadiness. That's more than most." He kissed her then, slow and sure, like nothing needed to be rushed. The summer passed with small work and long days. Maybeeth began laughing more, her shoulders looser. She helped Georgia bottle salves and learned how to tell when horehound was ready to harvest. Flint built the extra room, and when it was done, they painted the door a soft rust red from leftover barn paint. By the time the first frost came, Georgia knew every inch of the land like the back of her hand. She knew which part of the fence needed mending first, which corner of the garden held the richest soil. She'd planted bulbs for spring tulips, bluebells, and a few daffodils, tucked deep beneath the surface. One morning, after breakfast, Flint pulled a small scrap of cloth from his pocket. Inside was a piece of polished agate, worn smooth, drilled through the center. "I found it near the creek," he said. "Thought maybe you'd want it round your neck." Georgia touched the stone, then his hand. "I'd wear anything you gave me." He tied it with a strip of leather and fastened it gently around her neck. She stood on her toes, kissed him beside the jaw. They stayed like that for a long while, quiet in the morning light that poured through the window. Years later, folks in Dry Creek still talked about the land east of the ridgeline, where a woman had built a garden that never failed, and a man had raised a house with his own hands, plank by plank. They said the girl who came with nothing left years later with a dowry of knowledge and kindness, passed down from the woman who'd first opened the gate. But most of all, they spoke of the way Georgia and Flint looked at each other even after the years had gone silver at their temples. Like the wind had never once blown them apart. Like they'd found something in each other that even the hard prairie couldn't wear down, and they had. They'd built something lasting, together.